The water was still blue when Moses arrived at the bank. The Nile at dawn smells of cold mud and papyrus reeds, and the ancient certainty of a river that has never, not once in 10,000 years, been anything other than blue. The priests of Egypt washed in it each morning before sunrise. The children of Israel hauled it in clay jars to their labor sites. The crocodiles lay along its edges like old uncles, unmoved by the world. Moses was barefoot. He had been barefoot for 40 years, ever since the desert and the burning bush and the voice that would not stop calling his name. He stood at the edge of the sacred river, and he looked at it the way a man looks at something he loves and has been commanded to destroy. You should understand who Moses was in this moment, in this place. He was not a prophet in white robes speaking from on high. He was a man in his 80s, lined face, shepherd's hands, carrying a staff that looked like what it was, a stick he had cut from an olive tree 40 years ago to keep sheep in a line. He had spent his first 40 years as a prince of Egypt, in a palace he could see from where he stood. He had spent the next 40 years as a fugitive in the desert, learning silence. He had not wanted this assignment. He had offered God 5 reasons why he was the wrong person. God had answered all 5. He went anyway. Behind him, his brother Aaron carried the same staff, the one that had just days ago become a serpent before Pharaoh's astonished court and swallowed the serpents of Egypt's magicians whole. The court had seen this. The court had been impressed. Pharaoh had not cared. Pharaoh never cared about what could not unseat him. This morning, Moses had received new instructions. The instructions were not gentle. He turned to Aaron, who was watching the water with a face that could not quite settle on an expression, and said only,
"Raise the staff over the river. All the water in Egypt, every canal, every pool, every jar in every house, everything that holds water in this land, it will know."
Aaron raised the staff. The change did not begin at the surface. That is the thing the Egyptian chronicles never recorded because no one who saw it could find the right words. The change began somewhere below, in the deep current, in the cold dark beneath the papyrus reeds, in the places the crocodiles knew and humans did not. And then it rose, and the Nile turned. Blood. Not the color of blood. Blood itself. Thick and copper-smelling and absolutely horribly warm against the morning cold. Every fish in the Nile came to the surface, dead. The crocodiles retreated to the banks and would not enter the water. The birds that nested in the reeds screamed and scattered southward, a black cloud of panicked wings against the lightning sky. And it was not only the Nile. In the palace, in every villa, every farmhouse, servants who went to draw water from the stone jars found their hands covered in red. The pools in Pharaoh's garden, the sacred pools of the temples, the small jars of water that the Israelite mothers had saved for their children's morning meal. Only the Israelite jars stayed clean. Every Egyptian vessel in Egypt held blood. The smell reached the city within an hour. Moses and Aaron were already walking toward the palace. The throne room of Pi Ramses was built to make every person who entered it feel small. The ceiling was 60 feet above the floor. The columns were the width of 3 men standing arm to arm. The carvings on the walls showed Pharaoh, this Pharaoh, every Pharaoh, who was in the theology of Egypt the same divine soul reborn again and again, showing Pharaoh trampling the necks of foreign nations under his sandaled feet. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be. Pharaoh sat on his double throne and looked at Moses with the expression of a man who is genuinely curious about how this conversation will end. He was not afraid. This is important to understand. He was not a stupid man. He was not a cruel man in the way that novelists sometimes portray him, enjoying the suffering of slaves, calculating their pain. He was a man who had been raised from birth to believe that the universe had a correct order, and that he personally, by divine right, was its guarantee. The God of slaves, the invisible God, the one with no statue, no temple, no face, had disturbed his river. This was, in Amenhotep's cosmology, a fundamental misunderstanding of how things worked. His magicians would correct it. And his magicians did in fact produce blood from water. Not the river's blood, that was beyond them, but enough to demonstrate that Egypt's arts were not without power. Ka-Emwaset, high priest of Ra and the greatest ritual practitioner of his generation, produced blood from a clean vessel with an efficiency that earned him a nod from Pharaoh. He permitted himself a small professional smile.
The power of Ra is not diminished by a wandering shepherd's trick.
The wandering shepherd's trick had, of course, turned every drop of drinkable water in Egypt to blood. But the priests of Ra had produced additional blood from a vessel that already held blood, which was, in the official accounting, a response. Pharaoh turned from Moses with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who has decided something is beneath his attention.
He did not let the people go.
In the Israelite quarter of Goshen, the people heard what had happened at the river and did not know what to make of it. They had lived under Egypt's hand for generations, so many generations that the memory of freedom was a story their grandmothers told, not a memory of their own. Shimeon the elder, who kept the oral histories of their tribe, sat outside his door that evening and listened to a neighbor's child ask him a question.
The blood of the river, is it for us or for them?
He did not answer quickly. He said,
It is for everyone. The question is what it is for.
In the palace, Nefertari Mary sat at her window and watched the Red River move past below. She had grown up on the banks of this water. She had loved it the way you love what you have always assumed will be there. She pressed her hand over her mouth, not screaming, not crying, just covering the sound she might have made if she had let it out. She did not go to her husband that evening. There was nothing to say that he would hear. 7 days the blood remained. 7 days Egypt dug in the ground beside the river's banks, searching for groundwater, finding none. 7 days of copper smell in every market, every home, every animal trough. 7 days of Pharaoh's scribes recording official observations that did not use the word disaster.
And then Moses returned to the palace.
This is what the Lord says. Let my people go. And if you refuse, if you still refuse, I will plague your whole country with frogs.
Pharaoh refused. Aaron stretched the staff over the rivers, over the canals, over the ponds of Egypt, and the frogs came up, millions of them. They came in from the water like a living tide, and they filled the houses and the bedrooms and the beds and the ovens and the kneading bowls. They climbed the walls of the palace. They filled the throne room floor to the depth of a man's ankle, a carpet of living things that could not be stopped and would not be still. Ka-Mwaset's team, working quickly, produced additional frogs. There were now more frogs. Aaron said nothing to Moses afterward. Moses said nothing to Aaron. They walked back to their quarters through a city that was starting to understand that something had begun. Something larger than either side of this argument had words for yet. Back in the throne room, Pharaoh signed a decree noting that the frog situation was being managed. He pressed his gold signet ring into the wax. The frogs jumped across the table as he wrote. He did not look at them. His hand was steady. Aaron, walking beside Moses through the palace gate, observed, very quietly as if to himself,
He's taking the frogs better than I expected. Most rulers, you bring them frogs, there's shouting.
Moses did not respond.
The river was still red. The frogs were everywhere.
Pharaoh did not let them go, and the night that followed felt, in some way that no one in Egypt had words for yet, like a door being pushed open from the outside, slowly, with great patience, and with no intention of stopping.
The frogs died.
Not gradually, all at once, when Moses prayed, because Pharaoh had asked him to pray, had said the word please for the first time, had actually said to Moses and Aaron, please, ask your God, remove the frogs, and I will let the people go. And Moses had prayed, and the frogs had died, every single one of them in the same hour, in the houses, in the fields, in the palace, in the temple of Ra, where Ka-Mwaset had been conducting a counter ritual with increasingly diminished confidence. The frogs died and were gathered into enormous piles that smelled, in the Egyptian summer heat, of something primal and final.
And the piles smelled, and the city smelled,
And Pharaoh smelled it from his throne room and knew that the threat was over, and hardened his heart. This is the moment that theologians have argued about for 3,000 years. When the frogs were there, Pharaoh asked for mercy. When the frogs were gone, he took his word back. What kind of faith is that? And yet, how human it is. How recognizable. To bargain with God in the middle of the flood and forget the bargain when the waters recede. The Pharaoh of Egypt was not exceptional in this. He was, in his faithlessness, uncomfortably ordinary.
Aaron raised the staff and struck the dust of the earth, and the dust of Egypt became gnats,
A word that in the Hebrew refers to something so small. It enters your nose when you breathe, your eyes when you blink, your ears when you stop your mouth. Every grain of dust that the sandstorm had not already carried was alive. They were everywhere. On the priests, in the Holy of Holies, on Pharaoh's throne, in the eyes of the royal children, in the food being prepared in the kitchens, crawling across the faces of sleeping soldiers. Ka-im Wasit's team attempted to produce gnats of their own. They could not. This was new. Ka-im Waset stood very still in his laboratory, a magnificent room of alabaster shelves and careful organization where everything had always worked before. And he stood there in the gnats, and he looked at his hands, and he understood something. He did not say it yet, but he understood it.
He went to Pharaoh. He said,
Pharaoh looked at him for a long moment.
and hardened his heart. Then the flies came.
Not a few flies, a swarm, dense as smoke, darkening the daylight in the streets of Pi-Ramses, covering the walls of houses until the walls themselves seemed to move. They filled the officials' offices. They covered the livestock in the fields. They settled on the faces of the Egyptian people so thickly that a man could not see 5 feet in front of him. The officials' houses were ruined with flies. The land of Egypt was devastated by them. But in Goshen, where Israel lived, the flies did not come.
The border between the two regions was not a wall. It was not marked with any human architecture.
It was simply a line, visible, undeniable, where the swarm stopped. Egyptians who walked to the edge of Goshen could see it. Clear air on the Israelite side, a moving darkness on theirs. This was not a coincidence. It was a demonstration. Pharaoh sent for Moses. This time, he offered a deal. Moses said no.
We cannot. We must go 3 days into the wilderness, as the Lord our God commands. If we sacrifice here and the Egyptians see, it will cause offense. We must go as he has said.
Pharaoh's jaw tightened. He said, "Pray for me." The son of Ra asking a shepherd to pray for him. Moses agreed to pray. Moses prayed, and the flies left.
And Pharaoh hardened his heart again. There is a word that the text uses. In Hebrew, the word is kaved, heavy. Pharaoh's heart was heavy,
Which is, in ancient Egyptian cosmology, a familiar image, because when an Egyptian died, their heart was weighed on the scales of Ma'at against a feather. A heavy heart sank the scale. A heavy heart meant the soul had not lived in truth, the very theology of the nation condemning its ruler. The next plague came against Egypt's livestock. The horses, the donkeys, the camels, the cattle, the sheep, the goats, all of them in the field, in a single day.
They did not rise from the field again. In the Israelite camp, not a single animal was lost.
Pharaoh sent men to investigate. They came back with their report. Every Israelite animal, alive. He read the report. He read it twice.
And hardened his heart.
In the women's quarters of the palace, Nefertari Mary sat with the women of her household and listened to them weep. Her household steward, a woman named Tamit who had served her since childhood, sat beside her and said nothing. What was there to say? Her cousin's cattle were gone. Her sister's cattle were gone. The field outside the palace's eastern gate, where 300 horses had grazed at dawn, was silent in a way that a field with no horses in it should not be able to be that silent. Nefertari went to Pharaoh that night. She sat down beside him, something she could do as his chief wife that no courtier could, and she said,
Your Majesty, your presence brings unrest to my palace. Speak.
Pharaoh looked at his wife with something behind his eyes that was not quite grief and not quite anger and not quite fear. Something that had no name in any language Egypt had developed. He said, Nefertari did not answer him. She had heard what he had not said, that he was already afraid, that the expensive chair was all that was holding him together. She put her hand over her mouth, the same gesture she had made at the river's edge, and she left the room. And Moses returned to the palace the next morning with his jaw set and his staff in his hand. And Pharaoh saw his face and knew there was more. There was always more, and it was getting worse. He told himself it wasn't. He signed another decree. He pressed his gold ring into wax, and the wax was warm, and his hand, just for a moment, trembled. Just once, just slightly, but it trembled. And the night came down over Pi-Ramses like a hand being pressed over a mouth. The boils came without warning. Moses took soot from a furnace, the kiln soot, the ash of Israelite labor, the refuse of the brickworks where the Israelite people had spent their lives, and threw it into the air before Pharaoh. And the soot became fine dust over all the land of Egypt, and wherever it settled on human skin, it became boils, festering, swollen, painful with a particular persistence that made lying down impossible and standing unbearable. The magicians, Ka-Imwaset's team, the men who had matched Moses early in this contest, could not stand before Moses because of the boils. They were covered too. They could not perform their rituals because ritual requires stillness, and stillness was, for the moment, agony. Even Ka-Imwaset himself sat in the corner of his laboratory, the magnificent alabaster-shelved room where everything had once worked. He sat in the corner, and he looked at his hands, and he held the knowledge he had held since the gnats, and he let himself, for one moment, just know it. Pharaoh hardened his heart. Then the hail came, but it was not like any hail Egypt had known. God said to Moses, I could have struck you with a plague that ended all of this immediately, but I have let you remain for a reason, to show my power through you, so that my name will be proclaimed in all the earth. There is mercy in that word remain. There is the implication of what did not happen. Egypt was not simply struck down. It was struck and warned and given another chance and struck again. The hail was accompanied by lightning, fire running along the ground between the hailstones, a thing that those who survived it could not adequately describe afterward. It struck down everything in the fields, humans, animals, every plant of the field, every tree. For the first time in this account, a human being is described as dying. The text is specific about who was warned. God told Moses to tell Pharaoh, whoever fears the word of the Lord should bring their servants and livestock inside before the hail comes. Some of Pharaoh's officials, Egyptian officials, heard the warning and brought their people in. They believed, they acted, their servants lived, and other officials did not believe and did not bring their people in. The hail struck everything in the open. The storm could tell the difference between who had come inside and who had not. It could not tell the difference between Egyptian and Israelite, or rich and poor. It could only distinguish the sheltered from the unsheltered. And if you are still here with this story, if you have stayed through the blood and the frogs and the flies and the silence where the horses used to be, then you understand that this is not a story about ancient Egypt. This is a story about what happens when power mistakes itself for the universe. Subscribe to Faithful Tales now so you don't miss the night that comes at the end of this chapter. It is almost dawn. Almost, but not yet. Stay with us. Pharaoh called for Moses in the middle of the hail. The man, the son of Ra, the living God, the ruler of the greatest empire the ancient world had known, stood in his own throne room while lightning walked the floor of his kingdom, and he said, Moses looked at him for a long moment. He said he would pray. He said the hail would stop. He said he knew that Pharaoh and his officials still did not truly fear God. He was right.
The hail stopped.
And Pharaoh's heart hardened again. The officials who had believed enough to bring their servants inside did not speak. They looked at the floor. The locusts came next. An east wind brought them overnight. Morning came and the locusts were on the land. More than had ever been seen before. More than would be seen again. They covered the face of the land until it was black. They ate every plant that the hail had left. Every piece of fruit from every tree. Every green thing. Egypt was stripped. The landscape the Egyptians had known, the green delta, the wheat fields, the date palms, it was gone. What was left was the color of the ground beneath. And then Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was darkness over all the land of Egypt for 3 days. Not the darkness of a cloudy night, or a storm, or a shuttered room. A darkness you could feel. Not metaphorically, physically, the text says. People could feel it. The darkness had weight. It pressed against the skin. After 3 days in absolute darkness, not one candle working, not one lamp holding its flame. After 3 days, people could not see each other. They could not move. The darkness was not emptiness, it was presence. But in Goshen, where Israel lived, every person had light. 3 days. 3 days of feeling the darkness press against them, of reaching for the wall and not finding it where they thought it was, of calling for family members and hearing their voice but not being able to go to them, of a darkness so complete that the priests of Ra found their God's name tasted different in their mouths. On the 3rd day, Pharaoh called for Moses. How he found him in the dark, no account says. He made a new offer. Moses said, "You must also give us sacrifices and offerings for the Lord our God. Our livestock will go with us. Not a hoof will be left behind."
Pharaoh said,
Moses said,
Just as you say, I will never appear before you again.
Then God spoke to Moses, and Moses listened to what God said about the night that was coming. And the narrator does not record what Moses' face did in that moment, only that afterward he stood for a long time in the dark. There was one more plague, one more, the last one, and its nature, what it would take from Egypt, meant that nothing that came before it had been like it. The river, the frogs, the gnats, the flies, the livestock, the boils, the hail, the locusts, the darkness. Those had been a progression, a building pressure, a sequence of doors being opened by the same patient hand, each one revealing something more. This last door opened into something different, and Moses, who had stood steady at the Nile's edge, who had walked into the throne room of the world's greatest king without trembling, who had raised the staff again and again without flinching, Moses stood in the dark with what he had just heard, and his hand trembled. Just once, just slightly. God had described a mercy he was giving Israel, a set of instructions, a way to be passed over, a lamb, a doorpost, a night of careful preparation, a mercy given inside the judgment. And Moses understood something he had not fully understood before, that what was coming was not just justice. It was the cost of what justice looks like when mercy has been refused again and again and again by someone with the power to accept it. He went to tell Israel what was coming and what they had to do to be ready for it. The 14th day of the month. The Israelites had been preparing for this night for 2 weeks. On the 10th day, each household had chosen a lamb, 1-year-old, male, without defect. They had kept it for 4 days. They had known it by the 10th day the way you know an animal you have cared for. By the 14th day, the children had named it. This was not an accident. The instructions included this proximity, this time. The sacrifice would cost something personal. That was the point. At twilight, at the exact moment between sunset and full dark, every Israelite household in Goshen slaughtered their lamb. The blood was gathered in a basin. Then, with a branch of hyssop, the small desert shrub that grows in the cracks between stones, the blood was applied to the 2 doorposts and to the lintel above the door. 3 marks, a frame of blood around every Israelite door in Egypt. Moses had told them what God had said, that he, the Lord, would pass through Egypt that night, that he would see the blood, that he would pass over the marked doors. They did not know what was happening behind the unmarked doors. They suspected. The suspicions sat in the room with them as they ate, standing up, sandals on, staff in hand, ready to move, eating in haste, eating like people who would not be in this house much longer.
The night came down over Egypt the way all nights do, gradually and then completely, stars appearing one by one in the dark above the delta. The Nile moving in its banks, blue again now, water again, as if it did not remember what it had been. Fires lit in the Israelite quarter, fires lit in the palace. The city of Pi-Ramses breathing in and breathing out in the enormous respiration of a city that does not yet know what is about to happen.
And then, at midnight, something moved through Egypt.
The text does not describe it as a sound. It does not describe it as a wind. It does not give it a shape or a color or a speed. It simply states, "At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock."
And Pharaoh arose in the night, and all his servants, and all the Egyptians. And there arose a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not gone. In the Israelite quarter, the family sat and listened to the cry. It came from everywhere. It was not a sound that had words in it. It was the sound a civilization makes when it has reached the end of something, and knows it, and cannot find a language large enough for the fact.
Shimeon the elder sat in his doorway. The blood was still on the post beside him. The night air smelled of it. A child came and sat beside him, a small girl, the granddaughter of his neighbor, and she asked him the question she had been waiting to ask for months.
Is it over?
He did not answer her with words. He opened the door wider, and beyond it, beyond the lit street of Goshen, beyond the mud brick walls and the cook fires and the terrifying cry from the Egyptian city, beyond all of it, the sky in the east was the very faintest shade lighter than the rest. Not light yet, the memory of light, the promise of light. What dawn looks like from 1 hour before dawn.
He opened the door wider, and he let her see it.
Step aside.
Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. The palace was not quiet. It was a building full of people whose world had just ended, moving through corridors in the dark with that particular combination of shock and grief that robs people of their ordinary movement. Pharaoh's face, when Moses saw it in the torchlight, was the face of a man who had been proven wrong about the most important thing he believed, and had paid a price for it that no human accounting could adequately measure. He said, "Also bless me." Those 3 words from the mouth of the man who had called himself the son of Ra, who had not once in this account expressed any theological openness, who had hardened his heart 6 times against the clearest evidence in the ancient world. Those 3 words, "Also bless me." He was not asking for God's favor. He did not have the resources left for faith. He was asking for mercy from the only person in the room who still had access to it. Moses looked at him for a long moment. Then Moses left the palace for the last time. The momentum of a people finally in motion. The Israelites were ready. They had been ready since twilight. They had been ready, some of them, for their entire lives. The freedom that had only ever been a story becoming, in the dark of this night, a direction they could walk in. They took their bread, the flat bread, unleavened because there was no time for it to rise. They wrapped their kneading bowls in clothing and carried them on their shoulders. Their neighbors, Egyptian neighbors who had lived beside them all their lives, who had in some households loved them, those neighbors gave them silver and gold and clothing, whatever they asked for. They did not argue. They were afraid of the God who had moved through their city in the night, and they wanted Israel to go, and they gave everything they were asked. 600,000 men on foot, plus women and children, plus a mixed multitude of people from other nations who had lived among them and chose to go, plus flocks and herds and very large numbers of livestock, not a hoof left behind. A column of people stretching so far in both directions that those at the front could not see those at the back, and those at the back could not see those at the front. And the only way you knew you were part of it was the sound of that many feet, and that many voices, and that many animals all moving in the same direction in the dark. Miriam stood at the head of the women's column and did not speak. She was counting. She had been counting her people since childhood. How many had been born? How many had not made it through the labor? How many were lost to Egypt's world before they could be gathered? She was counting, and the number was larger than she had words for. And she held her tambourine. She had kept it through all of this, the tambourine, because she had known, and she did not play it yet. She would play it later. When they crossed the water, she would play it. For now, she just walked and counted and let the magnitude of the morning settle into her bones. In the palace, Nefertari Mary sat at her window. She watched the column of people moving through the city toward the road east. She watched them for a long time, their torches lit, their faces forward, their step the step of people who have somewhere to go for the first time in their lives. She pressed her hand over her mouth, the same gesture, the same hand, but different. Not the hand of someone holding back a sound of shock, the hand of someone choosing silence as a kind of witness. She did not want to look away. She made herself watch until the last of the torches was too far to see. This was the mercy she had wanted Pharaoh to choose. This ending, these people walking free. She had wanted him to give it as a gift instead of surrender, but they were walking free either way. She supposed, sitting there in the empty dark of the palace with the sound of the column fading east, she supposed that was something. Moses walked at the edge of the column and looked back only once. The palace, the city, the Nile running blue in the pre-dawn dark, as if it had always been blue, as if it had never known another color. The land that had made him, and the land he was leaving, and the land that would have to figure out, without him, what it meant to be Egypt now. He had been raised in that palace. He had played in those halls. He had eaten at that table and raced horses along that river, and learned to read Egyptian as a second language, and slept under the cedarwood ceiling of rooms that servants aired with fans made of ostrich feathers. He had come back to it as a stranger, as a messenger, as the man who delivered 10 announcements of catastrophe in a row, and never once enjoyed it. And now he was leaving it behind for good, and his jaw was set, and his hand was steady again, and ahead of him, stretching east into a desert that a voice had already told him not to be afraid of, was every person he had been sent to bring home. And the question the story leaves behind, the question it does not answer and was never meant to answer, is this: was it just? Was it merciful? Both? Neither?
The Israelite people walking free had waited 400 years for this night. Every generation before them had been born into chains and had died in chains, and had told their children stories about a God who had not forgotten them. That waiting had its own weight, the weight of lives that could have been different, of people who had asked God when and had not heard an answer yet. Justice for them was 400 years overdue.
The Egyptian families who had nothing to do with Pharaoh's decisions, the farmers in the delta, the craftswomen in the market, the children in the houses, they paid the price of a ruler's pride. They had not enslaved Israel. They had inherited that system the way most people inherit the systems they live in, by being born into it. The cry that went up from Egypt that night was the cry of those people. It was real. It was not nothing. Both are true. Both are always true. This is the honest weight of the story, that justice and mercy are not always the same direction, and the moments when they most fully collide are the moments that make us most human in our confusion. Moses stood on the side of justice, and it cost him his grief. Nefertari stood on the side of mercy, and it cost her her certainty. Pharaoh stood on the side of pride, and it cost him everything. The sky was lighter now. Not full light, but the quality of dark that knows what it is becoming. And ahead, the wilderness. And behind, Egypt. And God's pillar of cloud moving at the head of the column, visible against the sky, leading them somewhere they had never been that had always been promised to them. Somewhere in the column, a child asked their father a question. The text does not record what the question was, but fathers who are carrying their children into freedom in the dark have a particular expression: exhausted, terrified, overwhelmed with a joy they do not yet trust. And whatever the question was, the father answered it the way people who have waited 400 years for this moment answer questions, slowly, with their whole body, holding the child closer than necessary, not letting go. Moses stopped. He stood at the edge of the road and let the column move past him, every face going by. The children, the elders, the women with their wrapped dough, the men with their flocks, the mixed multitude who had chosen to throw their lot in with this story. And he watched them all go by in the dark, and his face did something private that no one who was looking at the column looked back to see. And then he turned, not to the palace, not to the Nile, not to anything behind him. He turned to face the same direction the column was facing. He took one step, then another. And somewhere in the middle of this enormous, slow-moving, frightened, hopeful, exhausted, weeping, singing, disbelieving crowd of people, Moses the liberator, Moses the shepherd, Moses the barefoot messenger, Moses who had not wanted this job and had taken it anyway, became just another person in the column, walking east, toward a sunrise he had been told to trust. The torches moved forward. The last sounds of Egypt faded behind them. The river ran blue, the sky brightened, and ahead, just ahead, farther than a night's walk, closer than 400 years, something that had no name yet waited for all of them. The way the promised land had always waited, patient and just, and lit with a mercy older than any story they had ever told about it. And they went.